The Nameless blade is a unique weapon to both Karel and FEH, but where does the sword version of Hauteclaire come from? As weird as this may sound, we learn a lot about the structure of Karel and Carla's family in a support conversation between FE6 Karel and FE6 Bartrey. Their B support conversation has Bartrey sharing about how he was traveling the world, trading himself, and how he met Karla. He explains that the sword she wielded was practically invisible. Karel, Karla's older brother, says he understands. He goes on to explain that his family had been brought up in the way of the sword. Their life was centered around the sword and how it would blind them from their own humanity. Karel's character in Fire Emblem 7 and 6 are drastically different. On one hand, we have this kind old man where the greatest swordsman of Elite would claim that he could cut air, yet his sword has no killing intent. And on the other, we have a Karel that's driven to feed blood to his sword. There is the Karel that is a sword saint, and the Karel that is a sword demon.
Feast, blade, feast!
It's explained in the support conversation between Karel and his sister Karla that there is a sword that his family had held for generations, yet only one member of the family can wield it at any given time. Knowing this, their father had tried to protect the sword, but Karel had slain both his parents and 4 of his other siblings. All that remains of his family is Karla. While the support conversation talks about how this is the family's destiny, to fight each other to the death and gain the right to use the sword, that doesn't seem to exactly be the case either. In Karel and Karla's B support and A support, Karel seems to be reminded of who he used to be before he earned the title of the Sword Demon. And while Karla is ready to be slain by her brother's hand, Karel, remembering his humanity, lets Karla live. It's implied that Karla marries Bartrey, the canon pairing for the two, and she passes away sometime in between the events of Fire Emblem 6 and 7, only to leave behind her daughter FEH, someone who would chase after the shadow of her mother. In Fire Emblem 6, we're greeted by a much older and wiser Karel. When talking to Rucker, another swordman that resembles what Karel used to be in the prequel, senses that Karel's blade has no hate. He then goes on to explain that this type of swordplay would beat them all. It's not clear as to what had happened between the events of 6 and 7, but it seems Karel had finally opened up his ears to listen to the earth and the sky. His philosophy on swordplay changes to, it's not about the sword, but about the individual self. And that seems to be the theme in the support conversation between Karel and FEH as well. Karel would go on to explain that the sword is simply a weapon to kill people, and there is no strength in the piece of metal, but rather it's within him or herself to become better and stronger.
The path of the sword!
Which is why it's interesting that Karel has a nameless blade. I can only infer that this is the blade that their family had kept as a treasure for so long. Only one member of the family can wield the blade at any given time, but the iteration of Fire Emblem Heroes Karel is from a timeline in which Karla is alive. And later on, the depiction of Heroes FEH is one that is still training, trying to catch the shadow of her mother and still alive uncle. So perhaps the Nameless blade isn't even the bloodthirsty sword that Karel and Karla alluded to in their support conversation, though this fact can be argued since Fire Emblem 6 Karel seems to be holding a weapon that's similar to the Nameless blade. This next section, I want to say that all my information was gained from Cantopia. I'll leave the Cantopia blog linking to this specific article below in the description, so if you want to look further into this topic, I highly recommend that you do. This blog post entails some translation issues that Karel had faced in his time in Fire Emblem 7. But to quickly sum it up and not take away from this amazing article, the translation did a poor job at talking about the quote, sword. Instead of the sword, it seems the original Japanese text alluded to a sword style that is deadly. It's almost as if this style of swordplay could disappear into the winds. So is the game talking about a physical sword, a sword style, technique? I think there's a combination of both. There is indeed a sword style that the family treasures and passes down generation to generation, but I'm personally under the impression that there is a physical sword that's been passed down more so than the technique. And this fact is supported by the original name of the Japanese sword, which roughly translates to Sword of the Nameless Clan. In Fire Emblem 7, Karel never found Carla worthy enough to kill until she took the title as the Princess of Blades from her insane arena win streak, and that's also why they attempted to duel in their B/A support. But in Fire Emblem 6, like I had mentioned earlier, Karel's sword loses the ability to kill, yet he's still regarded as the strongest swordsman in the continent of Leap due to his sword being able to cut and bend wind. And that's perhaps the reason why Carla isn't able to obtain the Nameless Blade in Fire Emblem Heroes. The depiction of Karel in Heroes is his Fire Emblem 7 self, one obsessed with getting the sword. Therefore, Carla could never receive and obtain the blade. Fur, on the other hand, can get the sword because she's from an era where Karel is much wiser. He recognizes that the sword isn't meant to kill, and therefore he can safely give her the sword as long as she's looking into herself to become a great sword master. But with that being said, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time.
させるものか